Internet access is just as important as electricity was, or water, or other basic services.
It's difficult to overstate the importance of technology to our lives.
The upcoming election will be the first where artificial intelligence could play a big factor, and experts are already sounding alarms for the misinformation that people can generate with these new tools.
While deepfakes are not new, it's the speed at which generative AI can create them that's the problem.
Deepfakes have made it sound like a candidate is saying something that the candidate never said.
But are our policies keeping up?
Trust in our institutions, trust in each other is at an all-time low. We're in this precarious moment of disbelief and distrust, coupled with the diffusion of the technology.
Platforms need to hand over more content about how the algorithms work, what the content does, and what the consequences are. If we're going to legislate responsibly about the management of the content on your platforms, we need to have better data.
And have we considered the potential dangers?
I think if this technology goes wrong, it can go quite wrong. We want to work with the government to prevent that from happening.
I view my job and the job of our company as building the best tools that we can to keep our community safe. We build AI tools
nonsense. Your product is killing people.
If Americans can broadly agree on nothing else, we should be able to agree that much of the bitterness and political tribalism that drives our public discussions is unhealthy for our country. In order to debate contentious public policy issues in a respectful and engaging manner without abandoning deeply held principles, the Cato Institute, in collaboration with the Brookings Institution, presents Sphere. In this episode, should we be optimistic about technology, online access and connectivity? We live in a time when technology has made us more connected than ever. Nearly all of us live with these devices in our pockets that give us access to the world. Some experts say that technology is transforming our world for the better. Others are more pessimistic and argue that some types of technology can bring destruction and disruption in ways that impede human flourishing. Joining me now to discuss these and other important issues around technology are Jennifer Huddleston, Technology Policy Research Fellow at the Cato Institute, Nicol Turner Lee, Senior Fellow in Governance Studies and Director for the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution, and Mark Meador, a partner at the law firm Kressin Meador and visiting fellow in technology at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Technology is a huge and broad topic, obviously, so here we're going to talk mostly about issues around online access and connectivity. And the three of you have quite a few areas of agreement, but also different perspectives around technology. So I'll do my best to draw those out. I wanted to start with an area that some people might find surprising consensus among you, particularly with a libertarian and a conservative on the panel, and that is that you are all fine with federal government issuing regulations to protect privacy on the internet. Jennifer, as a libertarian, I'll start with you. What are you thinking?
I know. I have to say, you can say that almost of a "what are you thinking" seems to be the tone when a libertarian says, there's a role for the federal government in this. And part of it is just how the dynamics over data privacy has changed in the last few years. So going back to about 2018, with the rise of European tech regulation on data privacy, the General Data Protection Rule, or GDPR, we saw a huge impact on American companies and American users. Following that, we've seen that in the absence of federal regulation, several states have started to act on data privacy, really creating a patchwork that could be disruptive and confusing for the marketplace, both for consumers and for innovators and entrepreneurs. So in a federal framework, if we're thinking about what would help to preserve that light touch approach that preserves consumer choice and allows innovation to continue to flourish, really we're going to have to look at that at a national level so that there can be an alternative to that more regulatory approach that we've seen in places like Europe, but also so that there's potentially something overcoming the risk of this continually developing patchwork.
So Mark, I think agree with that, but you would go beyond just making regulations more cohesive in the sense that you actually go further and ask for the government to restrict children's access to certain parts of the internet altogether. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I absolutely agree that we have to have a universal standard because of the size of the problem and the nature of our market. You need to have one overarching standard. But I would go further and say it's not just necessarily a light touch. That the way I think about this is the economic transactions involved. That when you use a service online, go to a website, right, there's an implicit economic exchange. You're providing data and allowing consenting to use of that data for their purposes in exchange for visiting the website, using the service, whatever that is. And we all sort of intuitively understand that, but I think we forget often the magnitude of the disparity and bargaining leverage between the two sides to that economic transaction. We sort of know, we have a rough idea of what data we're handing over. We often don't know how it's being used. Maybe it's nominally disclosed in terms of service, but no one reads those. But also, if you don't like it, there's no way to negotiate it, right? I can't redline the terms of service. I can't go to a tech platform and say, well, I'll agree to use your website as long as you limit your use of my data in this way. And so it's really a take it or leave it. And I think in that context, there's absolutely a role for our elected officials to step in on behalf of their constituents and say, we're going to make this economic transaction fair and more even-handed to ensure that people aren't being taken advantage of and that this is really a fair trade and that they're getting something of value that's commensurate to what they're giving to the platforms.
Okay, and you would argue that should apply not just to children but to everybody?
Yeah, yes. I think that principle absolutely should apply to all web users. I think with children the need is heightened, right? Mm-hmm. We don't let minors enter into contracts. But that's essentially what you have in a lot of web services, and so I think there's an even greater role to play there to protect them. And children don't have the same level of judgment as adults, and obviously you want parental involvement as well. But we have other areas of the law where we step in to protect children from entering into abusive economic relationships beyond just saying, the parents have to do this. It's your job to protect your children, right? We have laws that endeavor to do that as well, and I think this is an area where we could do that.
Okay, Nicole, you and Jennifer do you have any concerns with that approach?
Well, I think about this, and Mark sort of hit on it. The internet was designed and developed in a way to be very permissionless, right? And so we would not be sitting here today had it not been for the deregulatory approach that we've had over the 6 or 7 presidential administrations that actually helped us commercialize the internet. With that being said, we're now seeing the internet transform so many aspects of our society. So I do agree with my colleagues that we do need a national data privacy standard. I mean, having states sort of dictate what should be applicable to something that is pretty much borderless can be very tricky for people, because that means when you're going across state lines, you're going to have different applications of the types of rules and regulations prescribed by that state. So I do think some type of comprehensive national data privacy standard in line with what we've seen internationally wouldn't be a bad idea, because this data is what's fueling these new systems that I think Mark is referring to, which is the behavior of the internet has changed. Meaning we are able to not just be transactional, but our data becomes part of the acquisition and the primer for the production of other products and services that ride over the internet. With that being the case, I think I'm closer to Jennifer, Mark, than I am to you, right? Because I think that there still has to be a discussion around the role innovation has played to engineer a different type of society, a different digital economy, which hopefully we'll talk a little bit about the people who are not part of this, and what that means for our economic competitiveness overall. And so we just have to be careful when we're looking at how people transact on the internet, particularly kids, to remove some of the agency of how people want to participate in this innovative economy, and to avoid being so prescriptive that we're not able to support the ideation process and bring new products and services to bear in what's essentially becoming, a less analog and much more digital economy.
Okay, so in other words, you have concerns that some of the prescriptive regulations that Mark might favor would also impede people's use of the internet. And I want to catch on that point a little bit more, because Nicol, you also argue that we need to consider broader issues around connectivity, who gets online, how they get online, especially when it comes to marginalized communities.
Yes.
Is that what you're talking about?
Oh, yes, and a shameless plug, I have a book coming out August 6th on the U.S. digital divide that talks a lot about this area which we're in, where, again, coming out of a more commercialized internet that created wireless, created satellite, created so many really interesting things. I have to share this story. I was in an Uber listening, doing my regular work, and a guy's phone said, "You've got mail." And I stopped everything I was doing to say, "Do you still have America Online?" And he said, "Yes, I do." Right? My point is, we're so much beyond the beginnings of the internet and the way it was formed, but we have so many people who are not yet connected. So in addition to a broad swath of people not having really good privacy legislation, as we've all talked about, we have a lot of people who cannot even benefit from the internet. They cannot read those privacy policies, right? One, because they're written for lawyers, and two, because they're not online. And we've in many ways leapfrogged internet connectivity from the standpoint of you had to have a computer to get to America Online. We now have mobile devices. But even in that case, we see some limitations, and I saw this with my ethnographic research, where data limitations may be a bear, where people may not have, a steady place to live where they can actually park, home broadband. We saw during the pandemic, 53 million school-age children have to go home when they could not work at home. And about 30% of those kids were low income. They came from marginalized communities in urban and rural areas. And so I think, for me, that is a conversation that we need to have alongside the conversations we're having. We can create rules and policies and prescriptions, but we also have to make sure we have universal broadband.
Okay, Jennifer, so I'm going to assume that you might have some concerns with that, and that you don't think government regulations are the right tool to use to ensure broadband connectivity and access?
There are many benefits to being online, and it's important that individuals understand why being online is so beneficial, and the opportunities economically, for communications, for all sorts of things that this can provide. But the reality is, for those that are currently unconnected or underconnected, they don't have access to perhaps the high quality internet that allows some of the more advanced applications, we really need to take a step back and not make presumptions about why that is occurring. And the reality is, for different individuals and for different communities, it's going to be very different. We've seen that a robust private sector investment has provided a great deal of connectivity and a great deal of different connectivity options. My concern is, if we put this in the hands of government, we're going to see an attempt to dictate one-size-fits-all solutions for what's often a very unique problem. We may see higher costs actually emerge from the idea that everything needs to be connected through those kind of old computer systems where we're looking at something like fiber to the home only, when in reality, in some of our more rural parts or even in some of our cities, the better solution may be something like 5G connectivity through a mobile device, or something like the new satellite internets like Starlink that are available. So I have a lot of concern that if we allow the government rather than the private sector and local communities to figure out what works best for them, we're going to see something that very quickly becomes outdated, very quickly becomes too costly, and doesn't really solve the problem at hand. The other thing I think that we have to remember is that question of, why are these people not connected? We shouldn't just presume it's about availability or cost. There are also important conversations that need to be had to help people understand why technology can be beneficial. And at times we may have to accept that there's some percentage of the population that just doesn't want to be connected.
I feel like this could be a topic in and of itself, perhaps for another time. Let me pivot for now, Mark. I want to ask you a little bit, because I know you've raised concerns on the topic of the use of technology in elections, and that, correct me if I'm wrong, you think that we should mandate anti-deception tools and make it illegal. How would that work?
Yeah, I think there's a few components to it. The big one is transparency, right? There's two ways you could see AI, for example, playing a role in elections. One is by sort of a bad actor on the outside impersonating someone. Mm-hmm. I think it shouldn't be a controversial opinion that that's bad, that we don't want that. And we should, obviously the devil's in the details, but whatever we can do to prevent that or find ways to identify when it's happening and call that out would be good. But the other concern comes when campaigns and candidates themselves are using artificial intelligence to potentially mask defects in themselves or their campaigns, or to mislead voters in some way. And obviously, that's always been a potential, right? Politicians lie, use at 11. But I think this new technology allows these sorts of things to be done on a scale that's unprecedented and with an ease and speed that's unprecedented. And so we need to be extra cautious. I think it makes sense to require transparency, that there's a notice given if AI is used to prepare a campaign commercial or a phone call or something along those lines, to make sure that voters aren't being misled or deceived as to the true nature of that candidate's vigor, appearance, voice, whatever you might encounter. And then they can make their own decision, right? If as long as they know that's happening, I think that allows voters then to receive that information to decide, how to respond to it. But if there's no notice given that that was used to create an advertisement or whatever, you have a higher risk for deception, which obviously has broad impacts for our democracy.
Mm-hmm. Jennifer, do you see any problem with passing a law, these sorts of disclosure or transparency laws?
I have a few concerns of doing this again at a government level versus, say, allowing different companies, different individuals to figure out what the labeling should look like. As Mark kind of alluded to, this isn't exactly a new issue. We've had a lot of concerns about misinformation, disinformation, deep fakes over the last several elections, and we can actually go even farther back to things like the original invention of the camera and see that these debates have been around for a really long time. But rather than running to regulation, oftentimes what we need to allow to happen is social norms to evolve. So we may end up with a social norm that says if you're using AI in campaigns, it needs to be labeled. But I think we need to take the step back of what would happen if the government did that. So Mark mentioned a lot of the potentially concerning uses of AI in campaigns, but there are also beneficial and benign uses that have already been going on for a while that, if we see this in law, are likely to get caught up in such scenarios. So say you're using, your basic video editing software and you use an AI tool to remove something in the background. A truck drove by while you were filming your ad, or there were birds in the field or whatever, and you wanted to edit that. Most of us wouldn't say that's any kind of deception, but that could require the same type of labeling as a deceptive ad along the lines of the ones Mark described. There are also ways that using AI in campaigns could be incredibly beneficial to making campaigns more accessible to people, to providing things like auto-generated captions, particularly those that may be in a language spoken by a community that a candidate is serving, that again could be done through AI, but would require additional steps or restrictions under some of these proposals that we've seen put forward. I think typically our best solution is to look at ways of education and empowerment rather than assuming that there's a need for regulation, particularly around issues of speech. And what we're really talking about when we're talking about these issues of labeling of campaign ads and things like that are things that could end up involving a lot more speech than just those ads themselves. My final concern is if we have a label on all these things, is that label actually meaningful to the consumer? Is the consumer able to know the difference between this ad was deceptive and this ad just happened to use video editing software? If both those things are considered the same, which is what could happen if we see this done by law, are you actually improving the situation in any way?
Nicole, any final thoughts? Last word goes to you.
I know, I feel like I'm in the middle. This time I choose Mark. No. I think this is a really interesting question, particularly when we see the history of elections and have conversations on voter disenfranchisement. So I think, to a certain extent, I think we're saying the same thing, that there has to be some transparency around these tools. And as they get more advanced and sophisticated, like generative AI, we do want to have some type of consumer awareness or education that these tools are at play. The same token, we are seeing a lot of technology, and particularly in an election case, that can be so deceptive that the voice and face and other extractions become very hard for my grandmother to discern. And here's where I think government has to play a role, as we've done on broadcast television, to basically say that this is an election ad and there is some provenance to where this content originated. Here in Washington, we're talking about digital watermarking. It's a sophisticated way to sort of put an imprint on the original image so that people can trace it. Whether or not it's going to be effective still is interesting, because we're solving technology using technology to solve problems for everyday people, and we're not sure if people are going to have that literacy to do so. The issue that we have with companies basically monitoring themselves is I think they're beginning to show us that getting to market is more important than being right or democratic. And it's really important for us, as misinformation, disinformation flows in election processes, that we find a balance, right? Where does government play a role in helping us to do AI-generated content disclosure? I'm a huge fan of the labeling system from the standpoint of having something. I mean, when my dishwasher went out on me, went to a big box store, saw a big yellow sticker that basically said this is a collaborative effort between a variety of entities to tell me that this is the right amount of plastic I should have in my house, the right amount of efficiency in water, right amount of electricity, and I would like that assurances from government working in tandem with the private sector. So I think going forward with elections, we have to just figure out a way that we sort of raise the consciousness of people around the role of technology, and we complement that with other things. Because I do agree with Jennifer, people need as many tools as possible to get notice, and we know that the internet is that vehicle, but at the same time, we want people to really be an informed democracy and not one that is just going by what they see online.
I think that's yet another topic that we could explore a lot more. The purpose of Sphere is to debate and consider deeply contentious policy issues in a respectful forum. Thank you, Jennifer, Nicole, and Mark, for doing that with us here today. For more information about Sphere, please visit projectsphere.org. Thanks so much for watching.